He thought authority made him invincible. He thought a badge was a shield that could never crack. But that belief shattered the night he pulled over the wrong woman. The highway outside Jackson, Mississippi was quiet under the weight of midnight. Rain clung to the asphalt like glass, and the sound of tires slicing through puddles echoed faintly in the distance. Sergeant Mark Dalton leaned back in his cruiser, half bored, half hungry for trouble. He had been on the force for 12 years, long enough to believe the rules bent for him. Tonight he'd find out how wrong he was. Meanwhile, a few miles down the same stretch of highway, Elena Carter drove home from visiting her mother. The wipers moved back and forth in a slow rhythm. Her mind was calm, her eyes heavy from a long day, and the jazz song playing on the radio softened the edges of the storm outside. Elena wasn't wearing her uniform tonight. She wasn't Commander Carter of the U.S. Coast Guard this evening. Just a woman heading home in a navy blue hoodie, jeans, and quiet confidence. Then, flashing lights cut through her rearview mirror. Red and blue swirling through the dark, her pulse tightened. She had been trained for crisis situations, but that didn't stop the instinctive unease that comes when power approaches in the form of a flashing badge. She slowed, signaled carefully, and pulled over. Inside the patrol car, Dalton smirked. He didn't see a decorated officer or a woman with commendations from Washington. He saw someone he could control, another driver who would obey, apologize, and move on. He didn't yet know this stop would destroy his career. Elena placed both hands on the steering wheel, steady, deliberate. The rain pattered softly against her windshield as Dalton approached, flashlight in one hand, arrogance in the other. He tapped the light against her window. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation. She passed him the papers calmly. Was I speeding, officer? Dalton didn't answer. His flashlight swept across her face. He looked for hesitation and found none. That bothered him. Your left taillight's out, he said after a beat. Elena's brows furrowed slightly. That's not possible. It was serviced just last week. Dalton's lips curled. Are you arguing with me, ma'am? The words were sharp, bait designed to provoke submission. Elena met his stare, unwavering. I'm just saying I can have it checked tomorrow if it's out. Step out of the car. The command dropped like a hammer. Elena inhaled slowly. Is there a reason, officer? Because I said so. He took a step closer. His shadow stretched long across her car door. Rain trickled down his jacket, mixing with the growing tension between them. Elena unbuckled her seatbelt, her movements calm but deliberate. Every second felt heavy. She opened the door and stepped out, the night air cold against her skin. Dalton circled her, sizing her up. She stood tall, chin level, posture steady. He didn't like that confidence. It reminded him of people who didn't fear him. Turn around. Hands on the car. For what reason? She asked again. His jaw twitched. Are you resisting? Her voice remained even. I'm asking a question. The smirk faded. The silence stretched, sharp and fragile. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, we've got a non-compliant driver here. Then louder toward her. Turn around. Inside, Elena's training kicked in. She knew escalation. She knew when men like Dalton wanted control more than compliance. And she knew how easily things could spiral for women like her, especially women of color in towns like this. She turned slowly, placed her palms flat on the cold metal of her car, and kept her breathing steady. Dalton moved in too close. The cuffs snapped tight around her wrists. Far too tight. You don't know who you're dealing with, she murmured. Dalton laughed under his breath. Lady, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. He didn't. As she sat in the back of his cruiser, rain streaking down the glass, Elena's calm began to transform, not into fear, but into resolve. She'd been in rough seas, faced storms that could split a ship in half. This, she thought, was just another storm, and she knew how to survive those. Dalton drove, his sirens off, humming a tune to himself. He liked silence when he had someone in custody. It gave him the illusion of power. You military? He asked without looking back. Elena stayed quiet. Thought so, he muttered. Always got that chip on your shoulder. Think the rules don't apply to you? Her eyes met his reflection in the partition mirror. The rules apply to everyone, she said. That's the point, he chuckled. Not tonight, sweetheart. But deep down he felt the first ripple of doubt. Something about the way she spoke, the authority behind her calm, didn't fit his usual pattern. He just didn't know yet how deep that ripple would go. The small-town police station came into view, a tired brick building with a flickering light over the door. Dalton parked, dragging her out with unnecessary force. Inside, the air smelled of old coffee and indifference. He processed her quickly. Fingerprints, mugshot, the works. Other officers barely looked up. They had seen him bring people in like this before. No one ever questioned it. When the cell door clanged shut, Elena sat on the metal bench, cuffs now removed, but wrists marked red. She stared at the wall, her breathing calm, her mind already calculating. She didn't need rage. She needed strategy, because she knew something. Dalton didn't. Every move he made tonight was being recorded, both by the department's internal systems and by a certain device he never noticed clipped to her keychain. And when the sun rose, his world would start to crumble. The cell was small, damp, and smelled faintly of disinfectant and rust. Elena sat still, her hands resting loosely on her knees, her back straight against the cold wall. Hours ticked by. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. In the distance, she heard laughter, footsteps, and the shuffle of paperwork. The hum of a vending machine filled the empty space between moments. Then came the sound she'd been expecting. Dalton's boots. Slow, deliberate, arrogant. He appeared outside her cell. Arms crossed, grin stretched thin across his face. "Still feeling brave?" he asked. "You've got a long night ahead of you." Elena didn't answer. He stepped closer, fingers curling around the metal bars. "You could have made this easy," he continued. "Could have just said yes, sir, and gone home. But no, you had to play tough." Her eyes met his, calm and unflinching. "I didn't have to play anything," she said quietly. "You're the one pretending." The grin vanished. For a second, his composure cracked. Then he laughed, though the sound was forced. "You think you can talk your way out of this? You're in my house now." Elena leaned forward slightly. "That's what you think." He didn't like that answer. He wanted fear. He wanted her to flinch. Instead, he got a woman who saw right through him. A knock at the hallway door interrupted his attempt to reply. A younger officer, barely out of academy age, stepped in holding a clipboard. "Sergeant Dalton," he said, hesitating as his eyes flicked toward Elena. "We just got a call. You might want to take this," Dalton frowned. "From who?" The young officer shifted awkwardly. "The district attorney's office." Dalton's confidence faltered for a beat, then he recovered. "Handle it," he snapped. "Sir," the officer said carefully, "they asked for you specifically, and they mentioned her." He nodded toward Elena's cell. That was enough to make Dalton's jaw tighten. He glanced at her, searching for a sign that she knew something. But she just sat there calm as ever. He turned and followed the younger officer out, muttering under his breath. As soon as he was gone, Elena exhaled slowly. She could feel the balance shifting already. Somewhere, someone had noticed her disappearance, and that meant everything was about to change. Minutes passed. Then came the distant echo of raised voices. Dalton's tone sharp, defensive. The younger one quiet, uneasy. Elena couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough to smile. Phrases like chain of command and request for records. The walls of control he'd built for himself were starting to crack. When Dalton finally came back, his expression was different. Gone was the smirk. In its place, a tight, simmering anger. He stopped outside the cell, staring at her like she'd personally handed him his downfall. "What did you do?" he demanded. "I followed the law," she said softly. "Something you forgot to do. You made a call, didn't you?" "You called someone." Elena tilted her head slightly. "No, Sergeant. I didn't need to. People notice when someone like me goes missing." He clenched his fists, pacing once before slamming his palm against the bars. "You think your fancy connections are going to save you? This isn't Washington. This is Jackson. And yet," she said, her voice calm as ever, "it's your badge that's about to be reviewed, not mine." For the first time that night, he didn't have a response. He turned and stormed down the hall, slamming a door hard enough to rattle the hinges. Elena leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. Relief didn't come, not yet, but she felt the air shifting. The next steps would be bigger, and when morning came, she wouldn't just walk free. She'd make sure no one else endured what she had. By sunrise, the police station buzzed with tension. Whispers passed through the building like wind through tall grass. The DA's office had sent an investigator. Internal Affairs wanted records, body cam footage, arrest logs, disciplinary files. Someone upstairs had made a call and the message had traveled fast. When Dalton walked through the hallway, the usual nods from his colleagues weren't there. Instead, eyes darted away, voices dropped, and doors quietly shut. The walls that once made him feel powerful now closed in on him. By mid-morning, Elena was escorted out of her cell. Not by Dalton, but by a composed, sharp-eyed woman in a gray suit. "Ms. Carter," the woman said, extending a hand. "I'm attorney Rachel Miles, representing the DA's office. You're free to go." Elena stood, stretching her stiff shoulders. "That didn't take long." Miles smiled faintly. "It rarely does when the evidence is this clear." As they walked down the corridor, Elena saw Dalton at the far end of the hall. His face was pale, his jaw tight. For once, he didn't look like a man in charge. He looked like a man who finally understood he'd crossed the wrong line. Elena didn't say a word as she passed him. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything, but deep inside she knew this was only the beginning. Because men like Dalton didn't just vanish. They exposed systems that protected them. And that was the part she was truly ready to confront. Outside, the morning sun cut through gray clouds, washing the streets in pale gold. Elena took a long breath of the damp air, the weight of the night slipping off her shoulders. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But now she had the truth, and truth once seen can't be buried. She walked away from that building with steady steps, unaware that her next destination would be a courtroom where justice would finally look her in the eye. And this time she wouldn't just defend herself. She'd make sure no one else had to. The courthouse was cold that morning, the kind of cold that crept into your bones and demanded stillness. Rows of polished benches stretched beneath the high ceiling, and the murmur of reporters filled the air like static. Elena sat at the defense table, composed and deliberate, every inch of her posture radiating calm control. She wore a charcoal gray blazer, a white blouse, and a look that said she wasn't here to be intimidated. Across the room, Dalton sat rigid in his chair. His uniform was pressed, his badge gleaming, but there was a tremor beneath his surface that he couldn't hide. For years he'd been the man who dictated the rules. Now, he was the one being questioned under oath. The judge entered, a tall man with silver hair and a heavy stare that cut through pretenses. "Court is now in session," he said, voice steady and firm. The prosecutor, a woman named Anita Rhodes, rose first. Her tone was sharp but measured, every word a precise strike. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a misunderstanding. It's a misuse of authority that nearly cost an innocent woman her reputation, her dignity, and possibly her safety." Dalton shifted, his jaw tightening. Anita continued, pacing slowly. "Sergeant Dalton performed an unlawful arrest. He fabricated a reason for detainment, failed to report accurately, and, most damning of all, violated departmental policy by disabling his body camera during the stop." A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Dalton leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something, but the judge raised a hand for silence. "Ms. Carter," Anita said, turning to Elena, "can you recount, in your own words, what happened that night?" Elena stood, her expression calm. "When I saw his lights behind me, I pulled over immediately. I complied with every instruction, but from the moment he approached, he wasn't looking for compliance. He was looking for control." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. It carried the quiet authority of truth. She told them about the false accusation, the unnecessary arrest, the excessive force, about how he taunted her on the way to the station, how his confidence only grew as he believed no one was watching. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Even the judge leaned back, thoughtful. Then Anita spoke again. "We have corroborating evidence," she said, nodding to an assistant. A large screen flickered to life at the front of the room. It wasn't Dalton's body cam, he had turned that off. It was Elena's keychain device. The footage began to play. Dalton's voice echoed through the courtroom, arrogant and dismissive. His tone dripped with condescension. Elena's replies were steady, calm, professional. The contrast was damning. When the video ended, Dalton looked hollow. Whatever confidence he had left drained from his face. The judge folded his hands. "Sergeant Dalton," he said quietly, "you not only abused your authority but attempted to conceal it. This court finds your conduct reprehensible and unworthy of the badge you wear." Dalton's lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a look. The charges against Commander Carter are dismissed with prejudice. The judge continued. And I am referring this matter to Internal Affairs for immediate review. The gavel came down hard. The sound cracked like thunder, final and merciless. Dalton's world began to unravel in that single moment. Reporters scribbled notes. Cameras flashed. The once invincible officer sat frozen, staring at the table in front of him. Realizing that for the first time in his career, no one was going to cover for him, Elena turned slightly, watching him, not with triumph, but with a quiet kind of justice. She didn't need revenge. She had something better, truth. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter. Journalists clustered near the steps, calling her name. Questions flew through the crowd about the arrest, about accountability, about power. She didn't answer them all. She just said one thing: no one is above the law, not even those who wear it. Her words rippled through the air, captured by microphones and cameras, spreading far beyond the courthouse steps. By evening, her story was everywhere. Headlines, talk shows, news feeds. The truth had gone viral. Dalton, meanwhile, sat alone in a dim office, waiting for the chief to call him in. The noise of the courthouse still echoed in his head. He had told himself he was untouchable. But arrogance always falls hardest when the truth lands on top of it. He'd built his power on fear. Now fear was all he had left. The chief's office door shut behind Dalton with a heavy click that felt like a verdict all on its own. Chief Monroe sat behind his desk, a man built from equal parts authority and exhaustion. His gaze was cold, unmoving. Dalton stood rigid, trying to look composed, though the sweat on his palms betrayed him. "Sit down," Monroe said. The tone wasn't a suggestion. Dalton sat. The chair creaked under his tension. Monroe slid a file across the desk. It landed between them with a dull slap. "That," the chief said, "is your career falling apart in black and white." Inside the folder was everything. His arrest record, his complaint history, footage analysis, even testimony from his own colleagues. Pages of patterns he had denied for years were laid bare in ink. Unlawful stops, questionable searches, excessive force. All there. "I was doing my job," Dalton muttered. Monroe leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "No, you were doing whatever you wanted and calling it a job." Dalton looked up, face tightening. "You think I'm the only one who does it? You think I'm the problem?" Monroe's eyes narrowed. "Right now, you're the one sitting in my office about to lose his badge. That's the only problem I need to solve today." The silence that followed was suffocating. Dalton's mind spun, searching for a defense that didn't sound pathetic. He came up empty. Monroe stood, walking to the window. Rain streaked down the glass outside, matching the weight in his tone. "You brought shame to this department. And whether you realize it or not, you brought danger to everyone who wears this uniform the right way." He turned, face lined with years of command. "Internal Affairs will finish their report this week. You're suspended without pay, effective immediately. If I were you, I'd start looking for a lawyer." Dalton felt the words crush him. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. When he finally stood, the chair scraped loudly against the floor. He looked down at his badge, gleaming against his chest. That small piece of metal that had made him feel like a god for a decade. He unclipped it slowly, placed it on the desk, and walked out without another word. The hallway felt longer than ever. Every step echoed with years of arrogance catching up to him. Every officer who passed avoided his eyes. And as he pushed through the exit doors, the badge he had worshipped lay behind him, cold and silent. Across town, Elena sat in a quiet conference room at a federal building. Her case had sparked more than headlines. It had triggered an official investigation into the department's policing patterns. She wasn't here as a victim anymore. She was here as a witness and a symbol of what accountability could look like when people refused to stay silent. A panel of officials asked questions, taking notes as she recounted her experience once again, this time for the record. When it was over, one of them, an older woman with sharp eyes, said softly, "Commander Carter, your composure under pressure is remarkable. Most people would have broken under what you faced." Elena gave a faint smile. "I've been through storms worse than him. The trick is to keep steering until the sky clears." As she left the building, reporters waited outside again. They shouted questions about justice, reform, change. She didn't stop this time. She just said, "It's not about me. It's about fixing what's broken before it breaks more people." That quote traveled farther than she expected. By nightfall, it was replaying across national news. Commentators called her a hero. Advocates called her a symbol. But Elena didn't care for any of that. All she cared about was what came next. Dalton, meanwhile, sat in his small apartment with the blinds drawn. His uniform hung in the corner like a ghost of who he used to be. The television blared his own story, his name plastered beneath the words "under investigation." He muted it and sat in the quiet. His phone buzzed again and again, messages from people he thought were friends. Some offered pity. Most just said they couldn't get involved. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. Not the kind of powerless that comes from losing control of a situation. This was deeper. The kind that comes when you realize your control was never real to begin with. The department's internal report leaked 2 days later. It was worse than anyone expected. 10 confirmed complaints, dozens of undocumented stops, patterns so clear they couldn't be denied. The chief held a press conference that same afternoon. "Elena Carter's case has revealed systemic issues within our department," Monroe said, reading from his prepared statement, "and we will not hide from them. Sergeant Dalton has been terminated. A federal investigation will follow." Dalton watched it from his couch, his face pale, the room spinning. The words "has been terminated" echoed in his ears. He'd spent his entire life believing his badge made him untouchable. Now he couldn't even touch the door of the station he once ruled. For Elena, things were changing too. She received letters, messages, invitations to speak. People wanted her to represent strength, resilience, reform. But to her, it was never about attention. It was about impact. She thought of every name that hadn't made the news, every voice that didn't get heard, every story that ended before anyone cared. Her victory meant nothing if it didn't protect the next person. That thought drove her more than any recognition ever could. As the sun set that evening, she stood by her window overlooking the city. The skyline glowed orange and gold, the streets alive with movement. Somewhere out there, people were beginning to believe change was possible, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself feel peace. Quiet, steady, earned peace. But she knew peace didn't last forever. Change never did. The fight was far from over, and when the next storm came, she'd be ready to face it head-on. Weeks passed, and the city that had once ignored injustice began to talk about it everywhere. Cafes, classrooms, and city council halls buzzed with her name. The story of what happened on that lonely stretch of highway had forced people to look in the mirror. Some turned away. Others finally chose to see. Elena never asked for fame, but it found her anyway. Her calm defiance became a symbol that reached far beyond Jackson. Communities across the country began to question their own departments. Reporters called her a hero, but she didn't feel like one. Heroes chase glory. She just wanted fairness. Still, she showed up where it mattered. Meetings with city leaders, forums with reform advocates, even quiet conversations with young recruits who wanted to wear the badge differently. She told them one simple thing: power is meant to protect, not punish. Those words stuck. They printed them on flyers, pinned them on academy walls, quoted them in articles, and slowly something began to shift. Meanwhile, Dalton's world kept shrinking. He tried to fight the charges, tried to convince the public that it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence was too loud. The footage, the patterns, the witnesses, they all told the same story. He had built his authority on intimidation, and when that foundation cracked, there was nothing left to hold him up. His lawyer stopped returning calls. Former colleagues avoided him at the grocery store. Neighbors whispered when he walked by. The badge that once opened doors now closed every one of them in his face. Late one night, Dalton sat in his car parked near the old station. The building glowed under the streetlights just like the night everything started. He remembered how invincible he had felt behind that wheel. He remembered the sound of his own voice ordering her out of the car, certain she would obey. But most of all, he remembered the look in her eyes, steady, unafraid, unmovable. That look haunted him now more than any punishment ever could. He stayed there for a long time, watching the place he'd once ruled. When dawn broke, he drove away and didn't come back. Across town, Elena was preparing for something very different. She had agreed to speak at a public hearing where new accountability measures were being introduced. The room was filled with officials, officers, and citizens, some skeptical, some hopeful, all listening. When she stepped up to the microphone, the chatter stopped. She didn't speak like someone addressing a crowd. She spoke like someone starting a conversation the city had avoided for too long. "I didn't stand up to prove a point," she said. I stood up because silence has never protected anyone. For years, people have told stories like mine, but no one listened. This time, people did, and that's the difference. A hush followed. Then came the first clap, then another, until the room filled with applause that felt less like celebration and more like release. In the months that followed, new programs launched across the state. Body cam laws were rewritten. Community boards gained oversight powers. Officers received new training not focused on control, but on communication. Small steps maybe, but steps forward. For Elena, life slowly returned to its rhythm. She still served in the Coast Guard, still carried the same discipline and purpose. But now there was something deeper behind her calm, an understanding that one moment of courage can echo far beyond the person who lived it. She visited her mother often, sitting on the porch as the evening breeze carried the smell of rain. Her mother would hand her a cup of tea and say, "You did what was right, baby. That's all that ever matters." Elena would smile, watching the sunset paint the horizon in colors that promised a better tomorrow. Sometimes she thought about Dalton, not with anger, but with a quiet kind of pity. He had every opportunity to be a protector, but he chose to be a tyrant instead. And in doing so, he had lost everything. The system that once shielded men like him had begun to shift, even if only slightly. Because once truth cracks the surface, it spreads no matter how many try to cover it. On one of those quiet evenings, Elena stood by the water near the coast, the wind tugging gently at her hair. She watched the waves roll in, relentless and sure, breaking and reforming over and over. That was what justice felt like, slow, patient, but unstoppable. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "Every storm ends. What matters is what we rebuild after." As the tide rose and the horizon softened into night, she walked away from the shore with steady steps, her purpose clear, because the fight for fairness never truly ends. But as long as people like her stand firm, the world keeps moving inch by inch toward the light. And somewhere deep in that truth, even power learns humility, even fear learns silence, and justice finally learns how to speak.